In 43 years of Coast Guard service, Captain Marcus Rodriguez thought he'd seen every kind of maritime tragedy imaginable. Inexperienced sailors caught in sudden storms, mechanical failures in the middle of the Pacific, desperate mayday calls from sinking vessels. But what he found floating in the waters off Cape Hatteras on that grey October morning in 2019 would haunt him for the rest of his career. The debris field told a story that defied every principle of seamanship he'd learned, and at its center was a mystery so profound that it would rewrite how the maritime community understood trust, deception, and the deadly consequences of a single lie. The wreckage wasn't from some ancient vessel or storm-battered fishing boat. It belonged to the Morning Glory, a pristine 42-foot Catalina that had left Charleston just 6 days earlier with 2 souls aboard. A respected high school history teacher and his wife, both experienced sailors who had meticulously planned their retirement dream voyage. What the Coast Guard investigation would ultimately reveal wasn't just the cause of their deaths, but a deception so calculated and cruel that it sent shockwaves through sailing communities across America. This is the story of how one man's lie about a boat's condition turned a carefully planned adventure into a death trap, and why every sailor, from weekend warriors to blue water veterans, needs to understand what really happened in those final, desperate hours aboard the Morning Glory. Because what killed David and Patricia Mitchell wasn't the sea, the weather, or even mechanical failure. It was trust. Misplaced trust in a seller who knew exactly what he was hiding and chose profit over human life. David Mitchell had been dreaming of this moment since he was 12 years old, when his grandfather first took him sailing on Chesapeake Bay. The son of a Baltimore factory worker, David had worked his way through college, earned his teaching degree, and spent 34 years shaping young minds at Roosevelt High School in suburban Maryland. But every evening, after grading papers and preparing lessons, he would retreat to his study, where a faded nautical chart of the Caribbean hung on the wall, dotted with pins marking every island he and his wife Patricia planned to visit. Patricia, a former librarian with a master's degree in literature, shared her husband's passion for the sea. They had met at a sailing club in Annapolis in 1987, both crew members on different boats racing in the Wednesday night series. Their courtship played out across the waters of the Chesapeake, and by their second anniversary, they owned a modest 28-foot sloop that became their weekend escape from the demands of their professional lives. For 32 years of marriage, they sailed together every chance they got. David earned his captain's license and taught sailing to supplement their income, while Patricia documented their adventures in detailed logbooks, her precise handwriting recording everything from weather conditions to wildlife sightings. They were methodical, careful sailors who respected the sea and understood their limitations. They took Coast Guard auxiliary courses, practiced man-overboard drills until they became second nature, and never sailed beyond their skill level or their boat's capabilities. The plan had been simple and sensible: retire at 62, sell their house in the suburbs, buy a blue water cruising boat, and spend their golden years island hopping through the Caribbean and Central America. They had saved diligently, living below their means and investing wisely. By 2019, their nest egg had grown to nearly $400,000, enough to buy a proper cruising boat and fund several years of careful exploration. David spent countless hours researching boats online, reading reviews, studying specifications, and networking with other cruising sailors. He knew exactly what he wanted: a Catalina 42, built in the late 1990s or early 2000s, with a reliable diesel engine, recently updated electronics, and a track record of successful ocean passages. The Catalina 42 wasn't the fastest or most glamorous boat on the water, but it was solid, well-built, and forgiving. Exactly the kind of vessel that would keep them safe while they lived their dream. When David found the listing for Morning Glory on Yacht World in July 2019, it seemed almost too good to be true. A 1999 Catalina 42, impeccably maintained, located in Charleston, South Carolina, and priced at $165,000, about $20,000 below market value for a boat in similar condition. The photos showed pristine gel coat, well-organized rigging, and an interior that looked like it belonged in a boat show rather than a vessel with 20 years of use. The seller was Richard Hawthorne, a successful Charleston real estate developer who described himself as a meticulous owner forced to sell due to health issues. His listing was a masterpiece of nautical marketing, filled with technical details that demonstrated apparent expertise and love for the vessel. The boat had been professionally maintained at Charleston Marine, he claimed, with all systems recently serviced and documented. The engine had been rebuilt just 800 hours ago. The sails were less than 3 years old. The electronics had been upgraded with the latest Garmin chart plotter and radar system. Most importantly for David's peace of mind, Hawthorne claimed to have sailed the boat extensively, including 3 round trips to the Bahamas and a delivery from California when he first purchased it. This wasn't some dock queen or weekend warrior's toy. This was a proven ocean boat with a responsible owner who had taken care of every detail. David and Patricia drove down to Charleston in August to see the boat in person. Hawthorne met them at the marina, a well-dressed man in his mid-50s with the kind of deep tan and confident bearing that suggested years of offshore sailing. He walked them through every inch of the boat, pointing out recent improvements and explaining systems with the fluency of someone who clearly knew his vessel inside and out. The boat was everything the listing had promised and more. The hull was sound, with no signs of osmotic blistering or stress cracks. The rigging appeared well maintained, with relatively new stays and shrouds. The diesel engine started immediately and ran smoothly, without any of the smoke or rough idling that might suggest problems. Down below, the interior was clean and organized, with plenty of storage and all the systems a cruising couple would need for extended passages. Hawthorne had documentation for everything: receipts for the engine rebuild, service records from Charleston Marine, photos of the boat on various passages, and even a leather-bound logbook detailing his adventures. He spoke knowledgeably about weather routing, emergency procedures, and the boat's handling characteristics in different conditions. When David asked about any problems or concerns, Hawthorne was refreshingly honest about minor issues. A small leak in the forward hatch that he'd been meaning to address, a slight vibration in the prop shaft that the yard said wasn't serious. Normal wear items that any boat owner would expect. This honesty about small problems actually increased David's confidence in the seller. Too many boat sellers tried to present their vessels as perfect, which experienced buyers knew was never true. Hawthorne's willingness to discuss minor issues suggested he was being upfront about everything, which made his silence about the major problems all the more devastating. The sea trial went perfectly. The boat sailed beautifully, tracking straight and handling predictably in the moderate conditions on Charleston Harbor. The engine performed flawlessly, the electronics functioned properly, and all the systems David tested worked exactly as they should. Patricia fell in love with the boat's layout and the way it felt solid and secure underfoot. They made an offer that same afternoon. The survey and inspection process took 3 weeks, and every expert David hired confirmed what he already believed. This was an exceptional boat at a fair price. The marine surveyor found no significant structural issues, rating the vessel as being in excellent condition for its age. The engine survey revealed a diesel that had indeed been professionally rebuilt and was in better condition than most boats half its age. The rigging inspection showed recently replaced stays and shrouds, properly tensioned and correctly installed. Even the Coast Guard documentation was in perfect order, with a clear title and no liens or legal issues. David had learned to be suspicious of deals that seemed too good to be true, but sometimes, he reasoned, you just got lucky. The closing took place in early September at a maritime attorney's office in Charleston. Hawthorne arrived with a briefcase full of organized documentation, warranty papers, owner's manuals, spare parts inventories, contact information for preferred service providers, and even recommendations for the best anchorages in the Caribbean. He seemed genuinely sad to be selling the boat. explaining again that his doctor had advised against long passages due to a heart condition that made it dangerous for him to be far from medical care. As they shook hands after signing the final papers, Hawthorne looked David in the eye and said something that would later seem prophetic in the most terrible way. "She's a good boat, David. She'll take care of you if you take care of her. Just remember that the sea doesn't forgive carelessness, no matter how good your boat is." David and Patricia spent 3 weeks in Charleston preparing for their departure. They loaded the boat with provisions, spare parts, and safety equipment. They studied their intended route, filed float plans, and tested every system repeatedly. Patricia organized their new floating home with the same methodical care she had once applied to organizing the school library, creating storage systems and checklists that would keep them safe and efficient during their voyage. They joined the local sailing club for a few practice sails, getting familiar with the boat's characteristics and building confidence in their new vessel. Other sailors at the marina were impressed with their obvious competence and preparation. Dave Henderson, who kept his own cruising boat in the same marina, later told investigators that he had never seen a more thorough or careful preparation for a cruising voyage. The plan was straightforward: sail south along the intracoastal waterway to Fort Lauderdale, then make the jump across the Gulf Stream to the Bahamas for their first international anchorage. It was a route thousands of sailors had completed safely, and David's experience on the Chesapeake had prepared him for the navigation challenges and weather patterns they would encounter. They left Charleston on October 15, 2019, under crisp autumn skies, with a favorable forecast calling for moderate winds and calm seas. Patricia's final logbook entry from the dock was characteristically precise: 10:30 a.m. departure, light northwest winds, 8 to 12 knots, seas 1-2 feet, barometric pressure 30. 15 inches and steady. Destination, Fernandina Beach, Florida. Estimated arrival, October 17th evening. For the first 3 days, everything went exactly according to plan. They made good time south through the protected waters of the intracoastal, anchoring each evening in carefully selected spots and enjoying the routine of cruising life. Patricia's logbook entries from these days radiate contentment and excitement. Beautiful sunrise over Cumberland Island. Dolphins playing in our bow wave. Can't believe we're actually doing this after all these years of dreaming. Other cruisers they met along the way later described the Mitchells as careful, competent sailors who asked good questions, followed proper procedures, and seemed well prepared for their adventure. Tom Bradley, who anchored near them at Jekyll Creek, remembered David as the kind of guy who checked his anchor 3 times and always monitored the weather radio. Patricia impressed fellow cruisers with her detailed knowledge of their route and her obvious enthusiasm for the journey ahead. On October 18th, they reached Fernandina Beach and spent 2 days reprovisioning and checking weather conditions for the next leg of their journey. David called his daughter in Maryland, reporting that everything was going perfectly and that the boat was performing even better than he had hoped. "Your mother is already planning our next boat," he joked, during what would be their final conversation. They left Fernandina Beach on the morning of October 20th, bound for Fort Lauderdale. This leg would take them offshore, outside the protection of the intracoastal waterway and into the open Atlantic. It was a passage David had studied carefully, and weather conditions were favorable. Moderate northeast winds, seas running 3 to 4 feet, and no storms on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came at 2:30 p.m. on October 21st, when David transmitted a non-urgent radio call to the Coast Guard station at Mayport, Florida. His voice was calm and professional as he reported a minor flooding issue in the engine compartment that he was investigating. He gave his position as approximately 30 miles northeast of Daytona Beach and said he would provide an update within 2 hours. That update never came. At 4:45 p.m., a container ship bound for Jacksonville reported seeing a sailing vessel displaying what appeared to be distress signals about 25 miles off the coast. The ship altered course to investigate, but found only debris and an empty life raft floating in the increasing swells. The Coast Guard launched an immediate search and rescue operation, deploying helicopters, patrol boats and aircraft in a grid search pattern that covered over 200 square nautical miles. The search continued for 4 days, hampered by deteriorating weather conditions and the vast area that needed to be covered. On October 25th, Coast Guard Petty Officer Sarah Chen, searching from a helicopter at first light, spotted something that would break the case wide open. A floating piece of the Morning Glory's transom, with the boat's name clearly visible. More significantly, attached to this piece of fiberglass was something that would revolutionize the investigation. The boat's emergency beacon, still sealed in its waterproof case. Emergency beacons are designed to activate automatically when they contact seawater, sending GPS coordinates and identity information to rescue services. But the Morning Glory's beacon had been manually activated, meaning someone aboard had deliberately triggered the device before abandoning ship. More importantly, the beacon's internal memory had recorded not just the time and location of activation, but a continuous track of the boat's final movements. The data was devastating in its precision. At 2:15 p.m. on October 21st, the beacon recorded the boat's position as stable, making normal sailing progress southbound along the coast. At 2:31 p.m., exactly 1 minute after David's first radio call to the Coast Guard, the boat's movement pattern changed dramatically. Instead of maintaining course, the vessel began describing erratic circles and figure eights, the GPS track looking like the desperate movements of a boat out of control. At 3:47 p.m., the beacon began recording rapid position changes consistent with a vessel taking on water and losing stability. The final GPS coordinates, recorded at 4:23 p.m., showed the boat had traveled less than 2 miles from where the emergency began, suggesting that whatever happened had occurred quickly and catastrophically. But the beacon data, devastating as it was, only told part of the story. The real breakthrough came when Coast Guard divers located the main wreckage of Morning Glory in 45 feet of water, sitting upright on the sandy bottom as if it had sunk in a controlled manner rather than breaking apart in rough seas. Master Chief Diver Robert Walsh, who led the underwater investigation, described the wreck as one of the most puzzling he had encountered in 20 years of maritime accident investigation. The boat was sitting on the bottom like someone had gently lowered it down there, he reported. The mast was still up, the rigging was intact, and except for the obvious flooding damage, the vessel appeared to be in good condition. But when divers entered the flooded cabin, they discovered something that transformed the investigation from a tragic accident into a criminal matter. David Mitchell's logbook, sealed in a waterproof case and filled with entries that told a story of growing desperation and dawning horror. The final entries in David's careful handwriting revealed what had really happened aboard Morning Glory in those final hours. October 21st, 1:30 p.m. Noticed water in bilge, more than usual. Patricia checking forward areas while I investigate engine compartment. 1:45 p.m. Found the source. Hull to deck joint on starboard side near chain plates is separating. Can see daylight through the crack. This is not normal. This is not a storm-related failure. 2:02 p.m. Crack is extending. Water coming in faster than bilge pumps can handle. Have activated emergency beacon. This boat has a fundamental structural defect. 2:30 p.m. Called Coast Guard for assistance. Trying to slow the flooding but failing. Patricia is scared. So am I. The crack runs almost the entire length of the boat. This should never have passed survey. The final entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as the boat's motion became more violent, was the most damning. 4 p.m. Boat is going down. Life raft deployed but won't inflate properly. Fabric is rotted. We're going to try to swim for it. If anyone finds this, the seller knew. He had to know. No one sells a boat like this without knowing it's going to kill someone. Loam. The Coast Guard's subsequent investigation of Morning Glory's wreckage confirmed David's final assessment with scientific precision. The hull-to-deck joint, the critical seam where the boat's hull and deck are bonded together, had been compromised by a manufacturing defect that should have been detected during any competent survey. But more damaging was what marine forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Walsh discovered when she examined the failed joint under high magnification. The sealant and fiberglass repairs in the area were not factory original materials, but rather amateur patches that had been applied in a way that suggested someone had tried to hide the defect rather than properly repair it. Someone knew this boat had a serious structural problem, Dr. Walsh reported to investigators. The patchwork shows multiple attempts to conceal the damage using materials and techniques that were designed to pass a casual inspection but would fail under the stress of offshore sailing. Even more incriminating was the discovery of what marine investigators call seller's putty, a cosmetic filler that gives the appearance of solid fiberglass but has no structural strength. Someone had spent considerable time and effort making the defective area look perfect while ensuring it would fail catastrophically when subjected to the normal stresses of sailing. The investigation into Richard Hawthorne began immediately, but what investigators found was even more shocking than the evidence of deliberate deception. Hawthorne hadn't been the victim of bad luck or poor judgment. He had been operating a sophisticated maritime fraud scheme for nearly a decade. Federal investigators, working with maritime insurance companies and yacht brokers across the Southeast, uncovered a pattern of boat sales that followed an identical method. Hawthorne would purchase older sailing boats with significant but hidden defects, perform cosmetic repairs that concealed the problems, create elaborate documentation packages that suggested meticulous maintenance, and sell the vessels to unsuspecting buyers who trusted his apparent expertise and professionalism. The scheme was particularly insidious because Hawthorne targeted boats with problems that wouldn't become apparent until the vessels were subjected to offshore sailing conditions. A hull-to-deck joint separation, a compromised bulkhead, or weakened rigging might never fail during casual coastal sailing, but would become fatal once the boat encountered the stresses of extended ocean passages. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Hawthorne had purchased Morning Glory from a broker who had explicitly warned him about the hull-to-deck joint problem. Email records recovered from Hawthorne's computer showed that he had been advised to repair the defect properly or disclose it to potential buyers. Instead, he had paid a disreputable boatyard to perform cosmetic work that made the problem invisible while ensuring it would eventually prove fatal. The final piece of evidence came from Patricia Mitchell's phone, recovered from the wreckage, still sealed in its waterproof case. Her last text message, sent at 3:52 p.m. on October 21st, was to her daughter. "Boat sinking. Richard lied to us. Tell everyone. Don't let him do this to anyone else." The criminal case against Richard Hawthorne resulted in federal charges of maritime fraud, manslaughter, and mail fraud. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Morning Glory was the third boat Hawthorne had sold with hidden structural defects. The two previous sales had resulted in dismastings and near sinkings, but the crews had been rescued before anyone died. The Coast Guard investigation also revealed systematic failures in the boat survey and inspection process that had allowed Hawthorne's scheme to succeed. The surveyor who had inspected Morning Glory for David Mitchell admitted under questioning that he had been pressured to rush the inspection and had not performed several critical tests that would have revealed the structural defect. Perhaps most tragically, investigators discovered that David Mitchell had been right to trust his instincts about wanting a Catalina 42. The boat itself was fundamentally sound. It was only Hawthorne's deliberate sabotage and concealment that had made it a death trap. If the hull-to-deck joint had been properly repaired when the defect was first discovered, Morning Glory would have been exactly the safe, reliable cruising boat David thought he was buying. The trial testimony revealed the full scope of Hawthorne's deception. Expert witnesses explained how he had used his genuine knowledge of boats and sailing to create convincing documentation packages that made defective vessels appear to be well-maintained examples. His method was to tell the truth about small, obvious problems while concealing major issues that could prove fatal. Hawthorne was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for maritime fraud and involuntary manslaughter. But for the sailing community, the real legacy of the Morning Glory tragedy was the systematic changes it forced in boat sales, surveys, and safety procedures. The American Boat and Yacht Council implemented new standards for hull-to-deck joint inspections, requiring surveyors to perform specific tests that would detect the kind of hidden damage that killed the Mitchells. Coast Guard investigators now routinely examine the backgrounds of boat sellers in suspicious maritime accidents, looking for patterns of problematic sales. Maritime insurance companies began requiring more detailed surveys and background checks on both boats and sellers before issuing policies for offshore passages. The case became a standard study in marine law schools, teaching future maritime attorneys to recognize the signs of systematic fraud in boat sales. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The Morning Glory case forced the sailing community to confront the reality that their traditional reliance on trust and gentlemen's agreements made them vulnerable to sophisticated predators. Sailing magazines began publishing detailed guides on how to detect seller fraud, what questions to ask during boat inspections, and how to verify the accuracy of maintenance claims. The tragedy also highlighted the importance of proper emergency equipment. Investigators determined that if Morning Glory's life raft had inflated properly, David and Patricia Mitchell might have survived long enough to be rescued. The discovery that the raft's fabric had been rotted by improper storage, another detail Hawthorne had concealed, led to new Coast Guard requirements for life raft inspection and certification. For Captain Marcus Rodriguez, who had found the first pieces of Morning Glory floating in the Atlantic, the case represented both the worst and best of maritime investigation. The worst because two experienced, careful sailors had died due to another man's greed and deception. The best because their deaths had led to changes that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. David and Patricia Mitchell did everything right, Rodriguez said during a Coast Guard safety seminar 6 months after Hawthorne's conviction. They were experienced sailors. They prepared carefully. They bought appropriate safety equipment, and they chose a boat that should have kept them safe. They died because someone decided that money was more important than human life. But their deaths weren't meaningless. The changes that resulted from their case will save lives for decades to come. The morning David and Patricia Mitchell left Charleston for their dream voyage, they had every reason to believe they were sailing toward adventure and freedom. They had planned carefully, saved wisely, and chosen their vessel with the kind of methodical attention to detail that had served them well throughout their careers in education. They trusted in their own competence, in their boat's reputation, and in the integrity of the man who had sold them their floating home. That trust, betrayed by Richard Hawthorne's calculated deception, cost them everything. But their final desperate efforts to warn others, Patricia's text message and David's detailed logbook entries, ensured that their deaths would serve a purpose beyond Hawthorne's greed. Today, because of the changes forced by the Morning Glory tragedy, no seller can hide critical structural defects behind cosmetic repairs and false documentation. No surveyor can rush through inspections without performing the tests that would have saved David and Patricia Mitchell's lives. The sea is dangerous enough without human predators making it deadlier. The legacy of Morning Glory is that the maritime community learned to protect itself not just from storms and mechanical failures, but from the far more insidious threat of those who would turn dreams into nightmares for profit. Every sailor who checks their hull-to-deck joint, every buyer who demands detailed documentation, every surveyor who performs the complete battery of structural tests, they are all carrying forward David and Patricia Mitchell's final warning: trust but verify, because your life depends on both the truth and your ability to recognize lies that kill.